Every creature in Dravenhold believed the Vampire King's daughter had been born completely deaf. For 2 centuries, no one questioned it. Not the ancient vampire physicians, not the loyal court advisors, not even King Valerius Draven himself. She lived in perpetual silence, cut off from the beautiful and terrible world of sound, a perfect, ethereal porcelain doll hidden away in a fortress built on fear and whispers. But everything changed the night a new maid, Lillian, was summoned from the mortal realm. She wasn't a noble, a healer, or a scholar, just someone who paid close attention. What Lillian noticed during her quiet service in the hushed halls would unravel centuries of dark enchantment, challenge an immortal king's desperate, protective choices, and bring to light a truth that had been sealed since the night the little princess first drew breath. What began as simple duty turned into a dangerous quest. And what she uncovered would shock everyone, especially the father, who thought he had done everything to protect his only child. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We'd love to know. King Valerius Draven was a formidable monarch, feared across the supernatural world for his cold authority and ancient power. Yet, within the thick stone walls of Dravenhold Castle, he lived a very different existence. The massive Gothic fortress was isolated not just geographically, but acoustically. It was designed to absorb all sound, ensuring areas comfort. Despite its grandeur, the castle felt suffocatingly quiet, a mausoleum of lost hope. Valerius had lost his beloved queen during the catastrophic event of Aria's birth 200 years ago. On that night, the cosmos had gifted his daughter with a power so immense it terrified him, the voice of the moon, a terrible sensitivity to the emotional pulse of the world, transmitted through sound. Convinced that her true voice would herald the destruction of his kingdom, Valerius blamed himself for the curse. He dedicated his entire immortal existence to maintaining the suppressor's seal, the ornate, jeweled earpiece Aria wore. He had withdrawn from the world, delegating the running of his empire to advisors, unable to bear leaving Aria's side for long. Every evening, he performed the same sacred, quiet ritual. He would guide Aria's pale hand, trace the outlines of her face, and sit near her, trying to connect through touch and expression. Princess Aria, with her unnaturally white hair and ethereal glow, remained mostly motionless. She rarely smiled, never cried, and never seemed to react to the silent world around her. She was the very picture of stillness and tragedy. Valerius would speak aloud for hours, describing the view from her window, recounting stories of her mother's laughter, hoping against hope that some fragment might penetrate the veil of silence. He would cling to the smallest signs, the rare moment she would tilt her head, as if straining to perceive something he could not. Those tiny gestures were all he had. At over 1,000 years old, Valerius carried the weight of his impossible choice on his rigid spine. His crimson eyes, once burning with conquest, were now shadowed by profound grief and fear. He had sentenced his daughter to a life of silence to save his people, but every day felt like an agonizing failure. The kingdom was safe, but his daughter was lost. Dravenhold Castle itself reflected Aria's fate. It was a structure built of massive, sound-dampening stone, where thick velvet tapestries hung heavy and still, absorbing any stray noise. Servants moved through the corridors with the silent efficiency of ghosts, communicating in low, almost imperceptible signs and gestures. Every footfall was muted, every door closed with agonizing slowness. It was a place where sound itself was a criminal, and the resulting silence was not peaceful, but suffocating, a constant, heavy presence that pressed against the eardrums. Valerius's nights were not for rest, but for his sacred, sorrowful vigil. He would stand for hours in Aria's dimly lit chamber, the only illumination provided by low-burning candles whose flames barely flickered, casting long, nervous shadows. His gaze would inevitably fix on the single, ornate object that was the key to his entire agonizing existence, the mysterious, jeweled earpiece Arya wore constantly in her left ear. It was subtle, fashioned to look like an antique decoration of gold filigree and a tiny, dark ruby, but Valerius knew it for what it was: the suppressor of silence, the instrument of his sacrifice and his daughter's bondage. Every night he would approach her, his movements as slow and measured as the minute hand of a clock, and gently touch the cold metal of the earpiece. It was a point of contact, a ritual to ensure the arcane magic within the jewel remained strong. As he stood over her, his eyes, once alight with fierce, immortal power, seemed only to hold the reflection of the candlelight and the deep well of his helplessness. He knew that beneath the silence he had so painstakingly enforced, a monumental, world-shattering power lay dormant, the voice of the moon. His daughter was not deaf. She was sealed away, entombed in a protective, artificial silence to prevent her from hearing the destructive, emotional noise of the world and unleashing a chaos that would consume his kingdom. The air around Arya was an absolute void, a constant, enforced pressure of nothing. She sat in her high-backed velvet chair, her pale eyes fixed not on a window or a tapestry, but on the empty space directly before her, as if forever waiting for a sound that would never come. Valerius, the immortal king who controlled blood and destiny, was utterly powerless to breach that wall of silence. He could only watch, guilt and love battling fiercely in his ancient heart, as his only child endured the silent, soundless burden of a life that was less a life and more an endless, fragile truce with fate. Until the night the observant new maid, Lillian, dared to look too closely at the simple, gold earpiece the deaf princess never removed. The arrival of Lillian at Dravenhold Castle was a muted affair. She was a mortal woman, 23 years old, with sharp, perceptive eyes that seemed to take in too much of the shadowed world around her. She was pragmatic and quietly resourceful, traits honed by necessity. Her reason for accepting the post at a fortress ruled by an immortal king was desperate. She carried a massive, inherited debt that would ruin her family unless she could earn an unbelievable sum quickly. The pay at Dravenhold, notorious for its isolation and strange master, was just high enough to be worth the risk. Lillian's first impressions confirmed the whispers she'd heard. The castle was not merely quiet, like a forgotten wing of a manor. It was hushed, possessing an unnatural stillness that felt less like peace and more like a heavy, carefully enforced vacuum. The air itself seemed to resist vibration. She quickly learned that every surface was sound-dampening. The ancient rugs, the velvet curtains, the thick tapestries, all served a singular purpose: the absolute absence of noise. She was met by the head steward, a gaunt vampire named Greer, whose movements were like those of smoke and whose communication was primarily through stiff, precise hand signs, followed by near-silent whispers. He introduced her to the small, rigidly disciplined staff, each one bound by blood oaths to discretion and silence. Lillian received her warnings like commandments: never speak above a whisper, never enter the East Wing unbidden, and above all, treat Princess Arya as if she were made of fragile glass. Greer explained Arya's supposed condition, the centuries-long deafness, with a grave solemnity that bordered on dread, emphasizing that any sudden disturbance could shatter the princess's delicate balance. Lillian was assigned duties in Arya's chamber. This was her first true encounter with the object of the castle's suffocating fear and devotion. As she stepped across the threshold, the silence intensified, becoming a physical pressure. Arya sat still in her chair, a vision of pale, ethereal beauty, her white hair flowing over the dark velvet of her gown. Lillian approached her to help with her evening attire, a task that required careful, intimate proximity. She worked with the focused quiet of a true professional, but she couldn't help but study the princess's face. Arya's eyes were the first thing that truly disturbed Lillian. Pale as winter moonlight, They were believed to be unseeing by the court physician, but Lillian felt they were too wide, too observant for someone cut off from the world. They didn't dart around, but they held an unnerving, focused stillness, as if fixed on something just beyond the realm of sight. Lillian's training told her that deaf individuals often relied more on peripheral vision and observation, but Aria's gaze felt like an agonizing form of listening. Lillian's fingers, navigating the dark embroidery of the princess's dress, brushed the strange, jeweled earpiece, the suppressor of silence, and a tiny, cold pulse of magic resonated through her skin. Then came the moment that shattered the narrative Lillian had been handed. She was securing a fastening on the back of the princess's collar when a heavy oak door in the distant corridor, far beyond the sound-dampened chamber, shifted imperceptibly. The sound it made was not a slam or a creak, but a small, high-pitched squeak, a resonance caused by a loose floorboard being trod upon, a noise that should have been swallowed by distance, insulation, and the supposed deafness of the room's occupant. It was the faintest vibration, a ghost of sound. Yet, just as the imperceptible squeak reached Lillian's own hyper-alert ears, Aria's pale shoulders visibly twitched. It was a minuscule spasm, a reflex that happened a fraction of a second before Lillian's own brain registered the cause. Aria, the deaf princess, had flinching at a sound no one else should have heard, and she had done so before the sound had even fully arrived. Lillian froze, her fingers still resting on the jeweled earpiece. The air in the chamber felt suddenly thin. She looked from Aria's startled, wide eyes to the empty space where the sound had originated. The realization hit her with the cold clarity of a knife edge. Aria was not just twitching, she was reacting. She was not deaf. She was listening. And the stillness that enveloped her was not a state of being, but a prison. Lillian swallowed, the heavy silence of the room now feeling like a lie she was complicit in, and her simple, debt-driven employment instantly transformed into something much more dangerous. Lillian's days in Dravenhold, which had started as a straightforward act of servitude, now felt like a continuous, subtle act of espionage. The small, almost invisible flinch Aria had made at the sound of the squeaking floorboard had been a key turning a lock, revealing a vault of suspicion Lillian could no longer ignore. Her job was now twofold: maintain the facade of a quiet, efficient maid, and, in secret, test the limits of the princess's supposed silence. Over the next 3 days, Lillian carried out her small, harmless experiments. While tending to Aria, she would deliberately introduce minute vibrations and low-frequency sounds that might penetrate the deep silence of the chamber. Once, while polishing a silver tea tray, she let her wrist flick slightly, causing a light tapping against the surface of the metal. The sound was barely audible to Lillian, yet Aria, sitting perfectly still in her velvet chair, showed a subtle, involuntary change in her breathing rhythm. It was a shallow, sharp intake of air, followed by a slow, measured exhale. Another time, while bending to adjust the princess's dark gown, Lillian allowed herself to hum a low, almost subterranean note, barely moving the air in her throat. Aria's pale eyes, fixed on the void, did not move, but the skin around them tightened, and the pupils seemed to widen ever so slightly, a reaction that was purely internal, betraying an awareness her rigid posture attempted to deny. Aria was not responding in the way a sighted person looks at a light, or a hearing person turns toward a voice. Her reactions were internal, visceral, and instantaneous, the response of a creature desperately trying to process a sensory input it was being forced to ignore. Lillian realized that Aria wasn't oblivious to sound. She was drowning in a constant, disciplined effort to block it. Her perpetual stillness was not the result of deafness, but a defensive strategy. This growing certainty led Lillian to the most dangerous object in the room, the gold earpiece. One afternoon, under the pretense of meticulous cleaning, Lillian approached Aria's head with a soft cloth and a specialized silver polish. She began to clean the outer curve of the princess's delicate ear, moving slowly toward the mysterious, ornate piece of jewelry. The earpiece was fashioned with dark, detailed filigree, a tiny, antique decoration that looked expensive but antiquated. When her cloth finally met the gold, Lillian felt a distinct, faint humming vibration. It wasn't the sound of metal, but the pulse of magic. As her fingers began to gently trace the edges of the tiny, embedded ruby, attempting to lift the earpiece just enough to clean the skin underneath, a shadow fell instantly across her hand. "That is sufficient, Lillian," a voice whispered, sharp and devoid of warmth. It was Greer, the head steward, who seemed to materialize from the thick tapestry shadows. His hand, long, cold, and rigid, came down and stopped her wrist with an unusual, almost violent intensity. Greer never touched the staff. His gesture was not just a warning, but a physical barrier. His crimson eyes, usually remote, were now narrowed into pinpricks of icy malice. He signed a curt message with his free hand, his motions stark against the gloom. "Do not touch the accessory. It is vital to the princess's condition." Lillian pulled her hand back immediately, the residual coldness of Greer's grip lingering on her skin. The message was clear. This was not mere jewelry. It was the king's territory. It was forbidden. That night, Lillian's suspicions crystallized into near certainty. Driven by the fear that she was serving not a beloved daughter, but a prisoner, she broke a cardinal rule. She found a hidden and used vantage point in the corridor above Arya's chamber, a small, dark nook behind a suit of armor, and waited. Near the midnight hour, King Valerius Draven arrived. He entered Arya's chamber, not with a maid's quiet service, but with the hushed ceremony of a priest. He stood over his daughter, the heavy crown catching the faint candlelight, and began a ritual. Lillian couldn't see the exact words, but she heard the sound, a low, rhythmic chanting, uttered in an ancient, rumbling tongue that seemed to vibrate the very stones of the old fortress. It was not a language of comfort or prayer, it was an incantation of binding and suppression. Valerius's gaze was fixed entirely on Arya's head, his voice a drone, a hypnotic pulse aimed directly at the gold earpiece. As he chanted, the tiny ruby on the filigree seemed to catch and hold the light with unnatural intensity, briefly glowing before settling back into its dark coldness. The realization struck Lillian with painful force, extinguishing any lingering doubt. Arya was not deaf. She was gifted or cursed with an acute sensitivity to sound, a power so dangerous her own father had deemed it necessary to shackle her senses. The gold earpiece was not a hearing aid, it was a magical control seal, and Valerius's nightly vigil was not devotion, but the renewal of her sentence. The beautiful, silent princess was not resting, but enduring a perpetual, enforced isolation, bought at the price of her own senses and freedom. Lillian knew now that the moment she touched that seal, she had crossed a line, and her dangerous quest had truly begun. The knowledge of King Valerius's nocturnal binding ritual burned in Lillian's mind, making the suffocating silence of Dravenhold even more intolerable. Her task was no longer mere suspicion, it was an imperative. She had to understand the exact nature of the seal and what it prevented Arya from doing. Risking certain death, Lillian turned her attention to the one place the truth might be hidden from the king's immediate gaze, the oldest records in the castle library. She began her search during the long, early morning hours when Valerius retreated to his high tower, seemingly weakened by his nightly duties. Avoiding the main, easily surveyed archives, Lillian focused on the forbidden, dust-choked section of the library, navigating shelves dedicated to obscure and rare vampire physiology and ancient celestial covenants. After 2 nights of agonizingly quiet work, using only the faintest sliver of light to illuminate the crumbling pages, she found it. Tucked away in a leather-bound codex detailing the rare magical afflictions of royal bloodlines was a fragmented entry. It described a mythical affliction known as the lunar resonance, a sensitivity to the world's emotional frequencies transmitted through sound. Next to the description of the affliction was a marginal note, crudely drawn and filled with arcane symbols, referencing the very piece of jewelry that haunted her. The text was vague, protective, and coded, but the heading was stark and unmistakable: Aria's earring, control seals. The entry spoke of dampening circuits, life force conduits, and the sacrifice of sensory input for the preservation of order. The purpose of the gold earpiece was confirmed. It was a specialized magical prison, not merely a decorative accessory. Lillian knew then that she could no longer live with the lie of silence. The king was a villain forged by love, and the princess was a tragedy waiting to happen. She had to know what happened when the seal was physically confronted, when the magic was challenged. She returned to Aria's chamber just past the witching hour, when the castle's silence was at its deepest, most oppressive point. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a jarring, loud sound in the dead air. Aria was resting, her white hair spread across the dark pillows like spun moonlight. Her face, so still and placid, held the distant, untouchable quality of a statue. Lillian approached with the surgical precision of an assassin, yet every movement felt clumsy and loud. She knelt beside the bed, her own breath catching in her throat. She looked down at the tiny, delicate shell of the princess's ear and the ornate filigree nestled within it. This was the moment. The point of no return. Lillian gently, nervously, raised her hand and touched the jeweled earpiece. The instant her mortal skin met the cold gold, a powerful, deep humming resonance shot up her arm. It was not a physical sound, but a vibration that seemed to bypass her bones and travel straight to her consciousness. It felt like holding a live wire of pain and suppression, a confirmation of the overwhelming magical power embedded within the object. Aria wasn't just wearing jewelry, she was wearing an active, draining circuit. At the contact, Princess Aria's eyes snapped wide. The change was immediate and terrifying. The placid, porcelain quality vanished, replaced by a sudden, fierce shock, a recognition that was both heartbreakingly lucid and instantly aware. Her pupils, usually pale and diffused, contracted, focusing intensely on Lillian's face. In that single, drawn-out moment, Aria communicated a flash of overwhelming awareness, curiosity, and a terrifying, desperate hope, a silent plea that seemed to vibrate directly in Lillian's soul. She was present. She was listening. She was waiting. Before Lillian could even process the emotional impact of the girl's awakened expression, the silence of the chamber was violently shattered. "What are you doing?" The voice of King Valerius Draven was not a chant or a whisper, but a raw, explosive sound of pure terror and disbelief. He had burst into the room, no measured pace, no controlled entry, his regal composure entirely abandoned. He was standing stock still in the doorway, his silhouette imposing and terrible against the candlelight, his silver hair a wild halo around his pale face. His crown was slightly askew. His eyes were wide, crimson saucers of shock and murderous intent, fixed not on Lillian, but on her hand touching the seal. The king's expression, a perfect mask of control broken by sheer panic, confirmed everything Lillian had suspected. This was the one thing he feared above all else, the violation of his daughter's silence. Lillian felt the air around her suddenly thicken and grow heavy, the raw, furious magic of an immortal king gathering like a storm, ready to strike her down. She was caught, her hand still resting upon the secret, humming seal, gazing into the eyes of a child who was suddenly, terrifyingly, awake. The atmosphere in the chamber turned instantly toxic, charged with Valerius's unleashed, ancient fury. The king did not move, but the air around Lillian tightened with an invisible, crushing force. Before she could utter a single word of defense or explanation, a violent surge of telekinesis struck her. She was thrown backward with devastating speed, smashing against the cold, velvet-covered wall of the chamber, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. The sheer, raw power of his reaction confirmed to Lillian that she had stumbled onto the central, agonizing pivot point of his immortal life. Arya, still in shock from Lillian's touch, began to convulse slightly on the bed, her stillness finally broken by the sheer emotional noise of her father's rage, a noise that screamed past the weakened seal. Valyria stepped forward, his eyes blazing, his hand raised and vibrating with destructive magical energy. He was no longer the tragic, weary father, but the merciless king, ready to execute a trespasser. "You dare touch the seal? You dare interfere with what keeps her safe?" His voice was a dangerous, low snarl that seemed to vibrate the floorboards. "Did you think the price of your curiosity would be anything less than your wretched mortal life?" Gasping for air, sliding down the wall, Lillian desperately pleaded, not for her life, but for the principle of the matter. "She is not deaf. Your Highness," she flinches before the sound arrives. "You are not protecting her hearing, you are burying her soul. Look at her. She knows," Lillian cried, pointing a trembling finger toward Arya. "That hope in her eyes, is that the safety of a deaf child?" The mention of Arya's subtle reaction, the undeniable plea in her widening eyes, stopped Valyria's cold. The king's hand, still radiating power, hesitated inches from striking her. The sudden sight of his daughter's distress, spurred by the chaos of his own rage, seemed to drain the fury from him as swiftly as it had appeared. He collapsed onto the floor near Arya's bed, his massive, regal frame folding in on itself, the heavy crown slipping precariously on his brow. He looked utterly spent, centuries of emotional exhaustion finally overcoming the illusion of his immortal strength. In that moment of profound, tragic exhaustion, he revealed the truth. It poured from him, not as a king's decree, but as a father's confession. "Her safety is the kingdom's destruction," Valyrius whispered, his voice thick with a grief that spanned generations. He pushed himself back to a seated position, gripping the edge of the bed for stability. "Arya was born with the voice of the moon." He spoke the name as if it were a curse. "She was never meant to hear sound as you do. Her power is not physical, but emotional. She perceives, amplifies, and influences the emotional state of all living things, vampire, mortal, beast, through sound and vibration. Every whispered fear, every surge of rage, every silent throb of joy, it strikes her as a physical, deafening sound." He motioned toward the gold earring. "That device, the suppressor of silence, doesn't block sound, it dampens the emotional frequencies. It gives her the stillness she needs to simply exist, to keep her consciousness from being instantly shredded by the agony of the world." Valyrius then spoke the ancient prediction, the very foundation of his terrible choice, quoting it directly from the Scroll of Whispers. "When the voice of the moon is heard, the fear it reveals will be the sound of the vampire's end." He explained that if Arya's unmanaged power were unleashed, the accumulated, suppressed dread and malice of the Dravenhold vampire race would strike her as a blinding, deafening chord, which she would instinctively amplify and send back, shattering the emotional control that kept the vampires stable and causing the entire kingdom to collapse into a wave of suicidal, sonic chaos. "I had a choice," Valyrius continued, his crimson eyes swimming with pain. "Kill my newborn daughter or condemn her to a life of eternal, sensory-deprived limbo. I chose the seal." Lillian listened, her back aching against the cold wall, the magnitude of his sacrifice and his fear finally settling in. He was not merely a tyrant, he was a desperate, grieving father who had made the impossible choice to save millions by sacrificing the life of the one person he loved. But then Valyrius delivered the second, more horrifying piece of information, the dark deadline. "The seal is temporary. It was meant to buy us time to find a solution, but none exists. The ritual I perform nightly is a temporary reinforcement. If the magic is not made absolutely permanent, if the suppression ritual is not completed within the next 6 months, Her growing power will override the seal, and the resulting chaos will be uncontrollable. He stood up, regaining his terrible regal posture, though his exhaustion was palpable. The final sealing ritual will remove her power, yes, but it will also make her silence permanent, irreversible. She will be safe. The kingdom will survive. Lillian looked at Arya, whose eyes were still wide, watching the silent confrontation unfold, sensing the storm of emotion between the king and the maid. Lillian understood everything now. Valerius was protecting his kingdom by condemning his daughter to eternal, sensory-deprived limbo, an act of protective tyranny. But Lillian had seen the hope in those eyes, a hope that Valerius, blinded by fear and duty, chose to suppress. Lillian's moral dilemma had been made absolute: respect the king's impossible sacrifice, or free a suffering child condemned to silence, even if that freedom brought the prophecy of destruction with it. The devastating truth of the voice of the moon and the approaching 6-month deadline had left Lillian reeling, but King Valerius granted her no time for reflection. Her act of touching the seal, while resulting in a furious revelation, also resulted in immediate, strict punishment. Lillian was imprisoned, not in the dungeons, but in a small, remote chamber in the West Wing, a gilded cage with silent guards posted outside, charged with ensuring she never approached Arya again. However, the fragile state of the Dravenhold kingdom, balanced precariously on Valerius's fear and Arya's suppressed power, was about to be violently exposed. It happened late one night, under a sliver of new moon. An external crisis began miles away in the nearest mortal village, a place usually kept compliant and quiet through psychological manipulation by the vampire court. Tonight, however, the fragile control broke. A combination of a severe winter famine and the unexplained disappearance of several villagers ignited a ferocious riot. In Dravenhold Castle, miles away, the physical sound of the riot should have been non-existent, absorbed by the land and the castle's massive stone bulk. But Arya's power was not about physical sound, it was about emotional frequency. A wave of pure, concentrated fear and righteous anger, the collective emotional scream of hundreds of desperate mortals, traveled across the moonlit valley like a silent, invisible tsunami. It struck the ancient, weakening suppressor of silence with a force that Valerius had never anticipated. In Arya's room, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. Arya, still watched over by her heavily grieving father, let out a silent, gasping cry. She convulsed violently, her entire body arching backward against the luxurious velvet of her chair. Her slender hands shot up, clawing desperately at the gold earpiece, trying to tear the magical device from her head as if it were a white-hot brand. Valerius, sensing the influx of overwhelming energy, roared a command to the shadows, but it was too late. The emotional wave had breached the seal. The raw, unfiltered noise of the mortal's terror, amplified 10,000-fold by Arya's own inner resonance, became a physical force in the chamber. As Arya's struggle intensified, a terrifying new sign of her power manifested. Her pale, unseeing eyes began to glow a stark, pulsating silver, illuminating the chamber with an otherworldly light. From the center of her being, a soundless sonic pressure radiated outwards. It was not a vacuum of silence anymore. It was the sound of everything. It felt like the air itself was screaming. The exquisite crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling exploded first, not with the sound of impact, but with a sudden, deafening cascade of tinkling fragments that struck the marble floor. Next, the tall, arched windows of the chamber shivered, then burst outwards in a terrifying shower of splintered glass. The thick velvet tapestries, which had absorbed sound for centuries, now seemed to ripple and tear under the purely energetic assault. Valerius, though immortal, staggered back, shielding his eyes from the silver glare. He realized with horrifying clarity that this was not merely a surge of power, it was Arya's subconscious attempt to process and reject the tidal wave of negative emotion flooding her. Without the seal, her natural instinct was to become a sonic weapon, pushing the noise back out, but intensified. Lillian, locked away in her cell in the West Wing, felt the resonance even through the thick stone walls. It wasn't a sound she heard with her ears, but a low-frequency vibration of pure, chaotic emotion that resonated in her bones, making her teeth ache. She knew instantly the seal had failed. In the shattered ruins of Aria's chamber, Valerius, consumed by terror, understood the terrible implications. The seal was not a shield, it was a ticking time bomb. By preventing Aria from ever processing or controlling her gift, he had ensured that when the power inevitably broke free, it would be an untrained, destructive force capable of tearing the very foundations of the kingdom apart. Aria needed to learn to filter, to choose, to modulate, but the suppressor of silence had made this impossible. Grief and desperation fueled the king. Ignoring the shards of glass digging into his skin, Valerius threw himself towards his convulsing daughter. He closed his eyes, drawing upon the deepest, most sacred reserves of his immortal life. With a guttural sound of immense effort, he began to channel an incredible amount of his own life force and ancient magic directly into the shattered remnants of the gold earpiece. His face turned ashen, his silver hair seemed to dull, and the immense weariness that had aged him returned 100-fold. He wasn't just casting a spell, he was performing a blood sacrifice, using his own vitality to act as a stabilizing conduit, absorbing the worst of the psychic feedback and magically reinforcing the seal with his very essence. Slowly, agonizingly, the silver glow in Aria's eyes receded. The chaotic energy receded, and the destructive silence returned, heavier and colder than before. Valerius collapsed beside her, breathing shallowly, his formidable power temporarily spent, his life force gravely diminished. He had succeeded in buying them time, perhaps a few weeks, perhaps a month, until the final, permanent sealing ritual could be performed. But the cost was staggering. Valerius was profoundly weakened, a ghost of the immortal king he had been, and Lillian, observing the aftermath from the tense silence of her confinement, realized that the next confrontation would be the last. The king was running out of strength, and the princess was running out of time. The aftermath of the empathic storm left Dravenhold Castle a place of brittle nerves and heightened vigilance. King Valerius, physically depleted and magically strained, could not afford to execute Lillian, as her presence seemed tied to the current instability. Instead, she was placed under strict house arrest within the West Wing, but with one crucial, agonizing loophole, since the regular staff was too terrified to approach Aria after the shattering incident. Lillian was reluctantly permitted to attend to the princess's most immediate needs, albeit under constant guard by two stern, silent vampire knights. This fragile arrangement was all Lillian needed. The guards, focused entirely on preventing any physical interference with the earpiece, overlooked the subtle, nonverbal world unfolding before them. Lillian continued her duties with a hushed efficiency, but her interaction with Aria was now saturated with intent. She used the slow, deliberate movements of dressing and grooming to initiate a subtle form of communication. While brushing Aria's ethereal white hair, Lillian would gently tap patterns on the princess's shoulder, one tap for yes, two for no. She would trace large, clear letters on Aria's palm with her finger, slowly spelling out crucial, simple questions. Free? Want? Aria, whose awareness had been violently awakened by Lillian's initial touch and then amplified by the sonic feedback loop, responded with heartbreaking clarity. She was still bound by the necessity of stillness, but her hands, guided by the faintest movements of her mind, would grasp Lillian's fingers with surprising strength at the right moment. When Lillian traced the word free, Aria's eyes would widen in a silent, desperate affirmation, and she would squeeze Lillian's hand, not just yes, but need. She used faint, barely visible nods and movements of her pale lips to signal her profound desire for freedom from the stifling silence her father had imposed. She confirmed, without uttering a word, that the silence was not peace, but a constant, living prison. Lillian realized she was not working to save a kingdom, but to rescue a soul. Her first step was finding the counter-ritual. Relying on the vague, coded notes she had taken from the Forbidden Codex and exploiting her limited access to the ancient parts of the West Wing, Lillian researched relentlessly. She worked only when the guards rotated or when they were momentarily distracted by the castle's growing sense of dread. Finally, in a dusty grimoire bound in dried black leather, she found a corollary to the control seals. The text, cryptic and laced with dark warnings, described the only known method to violently break such a powerful binding, a specific, accelerated counterspell. The price was immense, requiring a massive, focused infusion of pure, renewable mortal life force. The ritual demanded a sacrifice of blood and concentrated energy from a non-immortal being, a temporary, willing depletion of soul strength. This was the only key that could shatter the powerful, immortal magic holding Arya captive. Lillian understood the implication. The spell required her. Her desperate quest for money had been replaced by a quest that demanded her very life essence. The king, though weakened, was not blind. He sensed the shift in Lillian's focus, the dangerous intensity of her clandestine research. He found her late one night, not in Arya's chamber, but in a small, unused solar where she was translating the final, damning lines of the counter-ritual. He appeared silently, his presence radiating a cold sorrow that was more devastating than fury. "Stop," Valerius commanded, his voice hoarse from the effort of his last sacrifice. He looked utterly diminished, his posture stooped under the invisible weight of his crown. "You are mortal. You are driven by a greed that I understand, or a sense of heroism I cannot afford. I will fulfill your original need. Leave now. I will bestow upon you riches beyond your imagination, enough to solve every debt, every problem, and secure your family for generations. I will personally guarantee your safe passage to the furthest mortal realm, where no vampire will ever seek you. Leave my daughter to her silence." Valerius stepped closer, his face etched with a despair that finally looked authentic. "I see what you are seeking. You believe you can save her. You cannot. You will only destroy yourself and this realm." He then revealed the root of his profound, paralyzing fear, a narrative he had kept sealed for 2 centuries. He spoke of his queen, Isolde, Arya's mother, who was gifted with an uncontrolled, similar power, a raw connection to celestial energy. On the night of Arya's birth, during the blood eclipse, Isolde had been overwhelmed by the cosmic forces, unable to filter the destructive energies, and had perished in a magnificent, terrible flash of power that annihilated the entire wing of the castle. "Her love for me, her power, became the force that killed her," Valerius whispered, tears of red, ancient pain finally slipping down his cheek. "I watched it happen. I held her ashes. I found Arya, newborn, already vibrating with that same cursed energy. I chose the seal because I have seen what this power does when it is free. My choice is rooted not in tyranny, but in the deepest grief and fear a father can know. Do not condemn her to the same fate." He was pleading now, king and man reduced to the same desperate level. He offered Lillian everything she had initially sought, asking only for her obedience and her absence. Lillian looked at the king, then at the open grimoire detailing the blood sacrifice, and finally, her mind fixed on the image of Arya's eyes, the shocking awareness, and the silent plea for life. She stood straight, meeting the king's grief-stricken gaze with a resolve that transcended her mortal fear. "I thank you for your offer, your majesty, but I cannot accept it." She gently pushed the book away, sealing her fate. "Your love is magnificent, King Valerius, but it is not life. It is a cage. You saw one form of destruction, the uncontrolled chaos, and you chose another, the eternal death of the soul. Arya deserves the chance to live, to know her own strength, and to learn to wield it. Even if that choice brings a terrible price, it is still the right to choose. I will not abandon her to a safe, silent burial. Valerius stood motionless, his body trembling, his last hope extinguished. He had offered his crown, his wealth, and his deepest secret, but Lillian's refusal was absolute. He had his answer. He had failed to buy her silence, and now he had no choice left but to fight her. The final confrontation was inevitable. Lillian's refusal to surrender Arya to permanent silence sealed the king's decision. She knew she had mere hours before Valerius, recovering from his last magical expenditure, would initiate the final, irreversible sealing ritual. Her escape had to be swift, silent, and flawlessly executed. She spent the next few hours meticulously preparing the distraction. Over her period of house arrest, Lillian had managed to gather various innocuous materials from the kitchens and medicinal stores. Using a mortar and pestle she had cleverly secreted away, she ground common castle herbs, dried sage, black pepper, and highly concentrated essence of iron into a fine, blinding alchemical powder. Her goal was not to injure the vampire guards, but to momentarily confuse their heightened senses, their acute sense of smell, their rapid vision, and their unnatural sensitivity to the subtle electric currents of magic. The time came with the shift of the night guard, just before the deepest part of the night. Lillian used a narrow window to release the powder. With a quick, powerful exhale, she blew the fine dust through the keyhole of her door, dispersing it silently into the cramped guard station outside. The result was instantaneous and chaotic. The vampires, whose internal systems were shocked by the concentrated, non-magical sensory overload, recoiled, coughing and disoriented, momentarily blinded by the sudden assault on their refined senses. Exploiting the split second of confusion, Lillian slipped out of her cell. She moved swiftly through the darkened halls toward Arya's chamber. The guards there were on high alert, but Lillian's focused determination lent her speed. She dispatched them not with violence, but with calculated distraction, using an ancient trick of misdirection she'd gleaned from the library. Throwing a handful of silver coins, a sound vampires instinctively abhor, down a distant spiral stairwell. The guards hesitated, and that was all the opening she needed. She entered Arya's chamber. The princess was sitting up, having sensed the chaotic shift in the castle's emotional frequency. Arya's eyes, no longer passive, locked onto Lillian's face with a fierce, desperate intelligence. Lillian didn't waste time on words. She lifted Arya gently into her arms, amazed at the lightness of the girl's body, and began their dangerous retreat. Lillian chose their destination based on her research, the underground catacombs. This was the castle's oldest, deepest foundation, a nexus of ancient power where the stone was porous, not to sound, but to memory and magical residue. It was rumored to be a place where the echoes of all past events lingered, the ancient, emotional noise of centuries of life and death, an environment so metaphysically dense it might help contain the sudden, explosive release of the voice of the moon. They descended through a hidden spiral stairwell, the silence giving way to the cold, damp air of the crypts. The catacombs were a labyrinth of marble tombs and vast, echoing spaces, the oppressive stillness replaced by a heavy, primal silence. Lillian placed Arya gently on a flat, ancient altar stone. Time was a blur, dominated by the urgency of the moment. She retrieved the necessary components for the counter-ritual, which she had prepared, a piece of pure black obsidian, a vial of consecrated oil, and a dagger with a copper hilt. She arranged them quickly around the stone. Arya watched her with an unwavering, fearful curiosity, her hand instinctively touching the gold earpiece, the source of her bondage, and the focus of the ritual. Lillian began the ritual in the ancient language of the grimoire, the words echoing strangely in the vast subterranean space. As she chanted the incantations of dissolution, she reached the final, critical step, the sacrifice. Taking the copper-hilted dagger, she paused, looking down at her own palm. The ritual demanded a substantial, willing infusion of mortal life force to violently break the king's immortal magic. She drew a deep, shuddering breath and prepared to make the cut. At that exact moment, a noise resonated through the catacombs, not a sound of footsteps, but a sound of will and fury. King Valerius Draven had followed them. Weakened by his sacrifice, he moved with the speed of desperation, sensing the shift in the ambient magic as Lillian began the dissolution spell. He appeared at the mouth of the chamber, his silver hair disheveled, his crimson eyes burning with a terrible light. He looked less like a king and more like a ruined god. "Lillian, stop this madness." His voice, though strained, boomed through the stone hall. "You cannot comprehend the consequences. That power will tear her apart before it tears the world apart. You cannot undo 2 centuries of binding." Valerius stumbled forward, his arms outstretched, pleading. He was running on sheer paternal instinct, his kingly duty now indistinguishable from his desperate love. Lillian held the dagger poised over her palm. She looked at Valerius, then at Arya, whose face was a mask of terror and agonizing anticipation. The ritual was underway. The air was thick with ancient, counterweaving magic. "It is already done, Your Majesty," Lillian said, her voice strained but steady. "The choice has been made. She will live free or not at all." She brought the copper dagger down, slicing across her own palm. The cut was deep and clean. As a thin, steady stream of her mortal life force flowed onto the obsidian stone, the jewel in Arya's ear began to vibrate wildly, emitting a painful, high-pitched screaming that was audible even to Lillian's mortal ears. The final, tense standoff had begun, the king's terrified love against the maid's compassionate defiance, all centered on the silent princess. Valerius begged, his face contorted in agony, but Lillian pressed her bleeding palm to the suppressor of silence, determined to finish what she had started. The magic was consuming her, and the kingdom's destiny was about to be violently rewritten. Lillian ignored the agonizing, desperate pleas of the king and the searing pain of the counter-ritual burning through her own veins. The mortal energy was draining rapidly, but her focus was absolute. She pressed her bleeding palm firmly against the cold, humming gold of the earpiece. The copper of the dagger, the warmth of her blood, and the arcane power of the incantation met the king's ancient, protective magic in a catastrophic collision. The ritual reached its climax in an instant of devastating sensory overload. The suppressor of silence, the object of 200 years of fear and devotion, could not withstand the focused assault. It shattered, not physically, but magically. There was a blinding, instantaneous flash of pure, silver light that filled the catacomb chamber, followed by a sound that was simultaneously an ear-splitting, tearing scream and a deep, shuddering sigh of release. The remnants of the gold filigree turned to dust, falling from Arya's ear. In that very second, Arya's power was unleashed. The silence that had been her prison for centuries vanished, replaced by the complete, unfiltered emotional soundscape of the entire kingdom. It struck her not as music, but as an instantaneous, deafening symphony of pure feeling, the suppressed lusts, the petty cruelties, the cold indifference, the constant dread of the vampire court, the fear of the mortals in the valley, and the deep, abiding grief of her father. It was too much. Arya screamed a real, raw, physical scream that carried no sound but tore at the air itself. Her eyes flared to an intense, pulsating silver gold, and she threw her head back, overwhelmed by the sensory input of all the world's pain and noise. The chaotic energy, the noise that Valerius had spent 2 centuries suppressing, tore at the fabric of the catacomb chamber. Ancient sarcophagi cracked, the air grew thick and heavy, and the very stone began to weep dust. Arya was losing control, her raw, untrained power amplifying the emotional chaos into a catastrophic feedback loop. King Valerius, who had rushed forward to intervene, was thrown back by the sonic pulse. He watched in horror as the prophecy unfolded before him. The voice of the moon was heard, and the world was beginning to break. But seeing the terror and pain on his daughter's face, seeing the destruction his own fear had wrought, something shifted within the king. His desire to save the kingdom was finally overwhelmed by the singular, unshakable instinct of a father to protect his child from pain. He did not raise his hand to cast a final, counterspell of destruction against Lillian. He raised it in an act of ultimate, final acceptance. Ignoring the mortal woman who had defied him, Valerius turned his back on Lillian and focused his rapidly diminishing power entirely on Arya. He had lost the power to stop the prophecy, but he could choose how it was realized. He channeled his last reserve of life force not to rebuild the seal, but to create a stabilizing conduit, a massive, energetic lightning rod that ran from his own immortal core directly into the swirling chaos around his daughter. He was absorbing the shock, taking the brunt of the emotional tsunami. As Arya's screams of agony peaked, Valerius began to physically wither. The immense energy of the emotional field, which would have killed a mortal instantly, rapidly consumed his immortal power. He managed to channel the chaotic, destructive noise into a manageable, single frequency, allowing Arya a critical few seconds to process the input without being destroyed by it. The light in Arya's eyes stabilized, shifting from a chaotic silver to a brilliant, steady silver gold. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the first truly voluntary breath of her life. The castle groaned above them and the ground shook, but the sonic chaos within the chamber subsided. Valerius, having given everything he had, was left a husk of his former self. He staggered toward the single source of natural light, the small, grated entrance to the catacombs, where the first pale rays of morning were beginning to filter through. He turned back one last time. His eyes, devoid of their crimson power, met Arya's eyes that were seeing him, truly sensing him, for the very first time. He offered her a faint, accepting smile, a final look of profound, unconditional love. Then, embracing the only path to true peace left to him, Valerius walked into the rising sunlight. The power of the dawn, forbidden to his kind, hit his weakened frame instantly. With a faint, shimmering sound, King Valerius Draven turned to fine, glittering ash, a final sacrifice to channel and dampen the birth of his daughter's immense power. The binding was broken, and the cost was paid in royal life. Lillian, weak and bleeding, watched Arya absorb the entire scope of the tragedy and the sacrifice. Arya lowered her head, processing the death not as a loss of life, but as a vast, profound wave of paternal sorrow, duty, and love. A moment later, Arya looked at Lillian. Her silver-gold eyes were full of the world's sound, full of awareness, full of the silent history of the catacombs, and full of the noise of the rioting valley above. She opened her pale lips, and for the first time, she spoke. Her voice was not loud, but resonant, a clear, beautiful, low tone that carried the deep emotional echo of the stone around them. "Here," Arya said, her first word. The resolution had arrived, bittersweet and costly. Arya, no longer the deaf princess, but the voice queen, stood amidst the ruins of her father's sphere. The kingdom above them was thrown into chaos by the sudden, uncontrolled emotional resonance that permeated the Dravenhold lands. But Arya closed her silver-gold eyes and extended her consciousness. She used her new, terrifying strength not to amplify the panic, but to find the single, pure tone of calm buried beneath the terror. With a soft, steady hum, she sent the first wave of fragile, genuine calm out across the kingdom. The era of silence was over, replaced by the resonant, challenging era of her voice. Lillian, exhausted and changed, rose slowly. She stood beside the queen who had been freed at the cost of her father. The two of them, the mortal Maid and the new immortal queen, looked up toward the narrow entrance where the king had turned to dust, their destinies irrevocably intertwined. Arya and Lillian, standing together amidst the ancient tombs, the faint morning light illuminating the dust of the sacrificed king. They were preparing to face the angry, chaotic world above, no longer hiding from fear, but confronting it with the terrible, beautiful power of the voice of the moon. A new story began, one of sound, sovereignty, and a bond forged in the shattering of ancient silence. When the deaf princess finally spoke, the kingdom itself learned to listen to the voice of the moon. If you are moved by this tale of terrible love and impossible choices, show us some love with a like and subscribe for more dark fantasy tales. What would you have done in Lillian's place? Respected the king's protective sacrifice, or freed Arya at any cost? Let us know in the comments below.